You're here for the first of 6 oral histories that we're going to be doing with people that worked in the Hamilton factory. And Kenny Koenig being our first guest. But, you know, one of the things, first of all, is that we're fortunate for a few reasons. First of all is that Museum's Assistant Director Stephanie Carpenter wrote the grant to the Wisconsin Arts Board, and they granted it, which is wonderful because, you know, we think about, you know, Hamilton being so important to the city and obviously to the museum. And, you know, we're surrounded by all this machinery and obviously the type that Hamilton made back in the day, but the machinery is pretty useless without the individuals that run it. And so the idea that we get oral histories is really important. It's just one more thing that you get to add that I think gets lost really fast. And obviously you, as somebody was in the factory, know that, you know, not that long ago you were working with a bunch of guys who are, you know, scattered in a way.
Displaced.
And we'll miss that. But I'm going to do my due diligence here and let you know that this program is supported in part by a grant from the Wisconsin Arts Board with funds from the state of Wisconsin and the National Endowment for the Arts. We're gonna begin pretty simply, and I'll start just by asking where you were born and when, if you don't mind. How?
Yeah, that's not a problem. I was born the 26th of October of 1944. So we were born in the Green Bay. Well, I lived all my life in Bolt, which most people don't know where that is, but there you go. It's about 18 miles from here. So we drove those 18 miles for 48 years. So we had a lot of miles on that travel time. But we when I got out of high school, we had a small farm out there. And, of course, I was an only child, so that's why I was spoiled so badly, you know, and things like that. But anyway, got out of high school and in 1963, and then the draft was going strong, and a bunch of the neighbors and friends were all enlisting in the Guard unit here in Two Rivers, so down here, and was in active duty for a while, and I got home, and hey, this is working all right, and a little farm, not too much work, you know. Yeah, and when my mother came out and says, we're going to find you a job. Hey, I'm okay. I'm all right. So we came down. My cousin was working down here, and I think maybe my aunt had something to do with a little inspiration of moving me to get a job. But he's since deceased, unfortunately. But we came down and went in for an interview, and the guy, personnel director, yeah, they were personnel directors, it's human resources now. Anyway, personnel director, he said, well, what are you doing tomorrow? Whoa, this guy. I don't know if I really want to, oh, well, all right, we'll give it a try. So this was a time when Hamilton's had an ad in the Herald Times here that wanted to know what, says, say, Mr. Farmer, what are you doing between harvest time and planting time this winter? Really? And they'd hire a lot of farmers that had less things to do in the wintertime, and a lot of those guys stayed. And I knew I worked a lot of them. So then, yeah, we got into the wood plant. Didn't like the steel plant, so we got in the wood plant and worked in assembly up on the 5th floor, which I spent about 35 years on the 5th floor, I think. But it was a nice view of the lake.
Yeah, I bet. I didn't get to see that until near the end.
Yeah.
But so let me back up for a minute. You said 48 years? Mm-hmm. You worked for Hamilton for that long?
Well, they started in '65. The February 1st of 1965, and they moved us out of there in November of 2013, but I didn't officially off the payroll, you know, there was severance and all this other stuff till the anniversary date of it was the 31st of January of 2013 that we got out of there.
Okay.
So, yeah, that was, still don't understand how it can be world's leader in laboratory furniture and fume hoods, and they just shut it down. It's crazy, but that's the way where things work now.
Yeah, sometimes. Well, so when you went in to interview, was there a position that you were thinking about, or were they just looking for...
This was, well, I liked working with wood, so, you know, that the wood plant was the option that I wanted to... When I first started, my dad had worked here for a while, and I thought, I can work there longer than he did. You only worked 5 weeks there, so...
You passed him by a little bit.
Yeah. But, yeah, we got into the wood plant and started with a $1.57 an hour. And it was on incentive. Of course, when you're the new kid, all the other guys know what cabinets have a better rate on them. So you always get the, give them to that guy. So you didn't make much incentive. And, we got paid every 2 weeks. And I still got some check stubs from, no, I cashed all the checks. Just had the check stubs that, you know, in a 2-week period, and the check was for $146. So it was, that was more than I was making, but I was working a lot harder.
Yeah. So anybody else in your family work at Hamilton?
My dad did.
Okay.
For that 5 weeks.
Now, your daughter was there at the end,
yes.
right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, Jen was there for, I think, well, when she graduated from college, nobody wants to hire you unless you have experience. So she was lucky enough to get a job in the detailing, and then she got into the special cabinet engineering and things like that, and she enjoyed doing that. She had an interior, she has a degree in interior design and things like this, so that had kind of helped her out in working with wood cabinets and designing them and special order stuff. So she was there, I think, you know, it was only supposed to be for experience, but she was there like 10 years or 12 years, I think it was.
Oh, okay.
She was there quite a while.
So, you know, you were talking about that preference of wood over steel. And then did you go right to the wood plant within the factory? Mm-hmm. Do you mind, just for sake of everybody's clarity, you know, it's a 3-block complex, but just sort of describe where it was in that whole mess of bricks?
It was on the 5th floor in Building 38. Building 38 is just north of where your 17th Street ran through underneath. And that whole building to the north of 17th Street, plus actually I worked right on top of the street most of the time. That's where it was.
Okay.
But it was on the 5th floor.
You were talking about the fact that, you know, you were working on incentives, so you were getting the slower building pieces. But what kind of stuff was that?
So building 10, 9, and 8 were completely stacked to the ceiling with wood cabinets, and they were called stock cabinets. Mm-hmm. Then we never got any overtime because whenever the stock ran low in the in the warehouse, that's when we would build, 25 or 30 or whatever to replenish that stock in there. So there was never a rush to get our stuff out. We always had plenty of backup for inventory that was in the warehouse. But whenever you had an order would come in, and the stock checker would gather up all the cabinets for that particular order and take them into the finishing area, and they would they have already decided the color that they were going to be, and then at that time we only made maple cabinets. They were making, I believe in the 70s they first started working in Kosciuszko, Mississippi.
Okay.
They had a plant, and they just did oak. And then when that place closed, they moved the oak and the maple together up here in Two Rivers. But then, toward the end of the operations there, we were making cabinets out of everything, bamboo and cherry and, every kind of wood you could find that they were making them out of. So.
Do you remember like who customers would have been back at that time? In other words, who this stuff's going to?
Yeah, well, right at the beginning, I never really. There was just order numbers on everything, so you couldn't tell.
Right.
They very seldom had customer names. It was always numbers. But then later on, when we started doing, when we were getting to American Hospital and all those times, then we were doing a lot of pharmaceutical companies.
Okay.
Novartis and Bayer and all of these. We were building laboratories for those, or furnishing their laboratories for them.
One of the things that has been interesting for me to find out, mostly being at the museum, is that we'll get these people coming in from sometimes around the world, and they're here to see the wood type, And then they get into that room over there and they realize that that wasn't the only thing Hamilton ever made. And on the other side of that, you have people that know of the product because they're from the area, or they simply had Hamilton products in their company, and they're surprised that they made wood type. But I don't think that this place would be here if Hamilton hadn't branched out into all those other things,
Well, they used to use it for, we had medical, dental, the steel and wood, and the wood type, of course. Like your schools, during the school year, there isn't as much business as there is in the summer when school is off, and then you're building product for the school that they can get it going for the school year again. So then all of these other products kind of filled in.
Okay.
So there was never anybody laid off. I mean, there was always. I remember one time the plant superintendent there asked me if I wanted to work in the steel plant. And that was a time when a lot of guys had hooks and fingers missing and things like that. And I told him that I had a lot of gloves I wanted to wear out yet. So we didn't go into the steel plant that time.
I know that it wasn't necessarily your area, but Hamilton was still making type when you started, and they continued at least on Jefferson Street until I think '85. But were you much aware of that part of the business?
Sure. We got, when you're there 48 years, you know where all the hiding places are.
Yeah.
So no, I knew I had a lot of people that I knew that worked in the wood type area. It was always interesting to see how they could polish that end grain up so well. And I know some of the guys that cut slice the logs, and we usually only got them in like November, December, January, so you didn't get the end grain checking and cracking.
Right, right.
And then they would cut them. They didn't dry them right away. They'd temper them for a while, and there was a special room in the kiln area there that they tempered them, and then the kiln was downstairs in that same building.
Well, that wouldn't have been. There's so many buildings in that place. But I
Yeah,
was gonna
this
say,
was the one out by the river, that lower one-story.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. Any idea how long they would have been drying that stuff?
They'd dry it over a year.
Okay. I mean, that's a long stretch.
Right. You know, and you had to monitor it so much because you couldn't dry it too fast, because once you got them checking, then you pretty basically just firewood. It isn't, you know, it isn't any good for type then because the cracks show.
Mm-hmm. I remember thinking about that, and I thought, well, there's got to be some really sophisticated tool, you know, like some sort of wood probe to determine
Actually,
the dryness.
they weighed it.
Yeah, when you told me that, I thought, well, that makes a lot more sense than what I was thinking about, but...
Well, technology has grown since then.
I suppose. You know, and in a general way, as a carpenter, you're always thinking about the wood because the condition of it makes your life easier or harder.
I know, we had one, he was just a salesman, you know, and he's telling me that, well, you know, we were doing some solid panels, and the wood grows, I mean, with the moisture and depending on the humidity and whatever, and it changes. And he's, well, it can't grow, it's cut down. Okay, I guess we don't have any more conversation.
Yeah, that he just eliminated all your problems, right? Well, you know, one of the things that I noticed is that when I would get up to the 4th or 5th floor, that your area felt a little bit different than the rest. Were you controlling that pretty well, just so your wood isn't warping?
Oh, we used to have the same guy that ran the kiln used to go around with one of the humidistats and the little globe and the bulb and all this, and spin them around, and they kept track of that every day.
Okay.
So then they used to humidify the place with right out of the steam pipes. And then they discovered that, oh, wait a minute, that stuff we put in the water to keep it from scaling and not good to breathe. So then they went to using, they were like set up like a spray gun almost, you know, that just used regular tap water. And there was a humidistat on there that you set for how much humidity you wanted, and air pressure, of course, to atomize the water, and that's how we kept everything moist.
Now, you know, 48 years, you get to know an awful lot of people. Were there many that were there a big part of the time that you were?
Sure. Oh, when I first started there was a lot of displaced persons from Europe.
Oh, really?
A lot of Polish. And I'm sure, well, that's how there's so many Polish names here in Two Rivers, I think, is probably some of that immigrants that came over, and they all had, you know, pretty much special skills too, but they came for jobs like everybody else does.
Yeah. So who did you work with the longest that you remember?
I know there was a 2-year period there that I had 8 different supervisors. They were hard to train. I don't know, there's
Always.
And I never left the department, so that was
Right.
that was a little crazy. But yeah, we worked with, you know, and I moved from the wood assembly, and then moved into, when wood assembly was slow at one time, and then I went into plastic laminate.
Okay.
That's where I was, you know, for the rest of the career there, I was in plastic laminate. But I did get up into the wood type, you know, a lot. Just one of the guys that I worked with, his dad was up there working, so we'd go up and visit him every so often. And just watching them pantograph those things kind of.
Yeah.
And if you look at all of the machinery now and see what an OSHA standard is,
Well, you know, and you were saying a little while ago, you know, there are a number of people who were missing parts of fingers and stuff like that.
that was from the steel plant, basically.
Okay.
There was some wood plant incidents too, but yeah, the steel plant was, and then they put in light guards and all these other things.
Mm-hmm. I would think that would have been another interesting thing to see, just in terms of the tools you were using, because, you know, 63 to 83 to 03, the everything from more and more guards to faster
Sure.
tools and stuff.
And then, you know, they went from all hard dies for the press rooms and everything to lasers and for shears and all these things. We had all of the latest equipment there. Same way with in the wood plant, you know, the Bucelatos. Well, my daughter did a lot of programming. You could program the machine upstairs, and the machine you just punched in the numbers again for that program, put the wood in, and the machine just danced around and cut it out.
Yeah. Wow. So,
Did all the dowel holes and all that stuff. And that ain't gonna match up. Oh, they always matched up.
wow. You know, it's there's so many changes. So you're talking about, for example, you know, 8 supervisors, 2 years, but the other part of that is how many owners over that period of time.
Yeah,
right?
it was, when I first started, Hamilton's owned it. And then, wow, I might be mixing these up. I know Bransick bought it then, Charles Bransick. And then American Hospital bought it, I think. And then then Fisher bought us. And then Thermo bought after that. But they might have missed somebody in there too. There was quite a few different owners.
Yeah.
A lot of different vice presidents and presidents too.
I imagine. Did you feel much difference as that went from owner to owner? I mean, who is the best?
Well, I know who's the worst.
We can start there and work our way up if that's
No, this
easier.
is at the end. Thermo is the worst. These are the guys that took careers away on everybody here and families. There's a lot of people that had husband and wife, kids. Everybody worked there, you know, and it was a good paying manufacturing job, and they just that would be the worst. But it all worked out. American Hospital was pretty good. Actually, Bransick was pretty good too. He was a private owner, so he didn't have to do things for the stockholders.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
so.
right. You were also the Carpenters Union steward. Would that be the right?
I was on the bargaining committee since 1978. Then I got to be president of the union I was president for about 10 years, I think.
Okay. How big was the union at Hamilton?
We had, with the steel and wood plant at one time, we had 1,200 employees.
Wow. That's a good sized number. I remember a day I was complaining to you because Kenny ended his day by coming through the museum on his way out to the parking lot, and a particularly rainy day, I was complaining about leaks in the museum, and you said, Jim, I take an umbrella when I go to the bathroom, so I quit complaining to him. But you know, that was I remember going through and seeing the barrels and stuff, and I'm just sort of curious. Over that time, obviously that building was deteriorating, but it must have been more noticeable at one point where, you know, it's not getting fixed. Right?
Yeah, well, there was, in that area where you were with the museum, and just east of that, there was, the roof was falling in at one time. And then they decided they were going to leave it fall down. everything south of 17th Street at that time. And then they started doing a little more manufacturing and things. Some of the products changes and they needed more room. So then they started using it again.
Before I forget, we were talking about the lumber that they would get in the winter for cutting type. Any idea where that came from?
Algoma hardwood.
Algoma hardwood, okay.
Or wherever they got a better deal, I guess. But
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was Algoma hardwood most of the time.
Well, not too far away either, which is kind of nice. They had that stored near the river, right? I mean, in terms of the logs that were...
Well, they had to cut them when they got them in. You know, that was a couple of week job to cut enough type, what they thought they'd need for the next year. So it was always in advance of what they thought the business would be doing and how much they'd have to have.
Yeah. Not to bring up a tough subject, but still, I saw the closing from the outside in a way. I mean, the wood type museum, I'd run into you guys, but that's not the same as being as affected by it quite the same. When did you start getting the idea that this was just not going to go?
When Thermo put their name on the trucks.
So 98 or
Somewhere,
95?
yeah, could have been in there. And then they brought a new CEO in that he was actually was what's his name, Norm from Cheers. He was the corporate hitman.
Nice. Did that make life difficult for you just because, you know, were they not investing in new equipment or better stuff?
Actually, toward the end, they invested in equipment that we couldn't use. And then they changed things around that made absolutely no sense. When they moved the rough mill from building 38 out into building, oh man, it's like the Quonset hut out there on the end. It's a part of the old steel plant. Just to get the wiring, the simple wiring and the conduit to get over to that part of the plant for that machine, $14,000 just for the wiring. That wasn't in talking about putting it in. That was just for the wiring.
Just for the stuff.
And that didn't need to be moved.
So you can start to see.
But there was there was crazy stuff that went on there that, like I'm sure all other companies that see that same situation when they want to move or leave or whatever it is.
Well, and then, you know, by the time even I got to the museum, even as a volunteer, late in that time, you know, maybe early 2000s, there was a lot of empty spaces. I mean, they must have been sort of cutting as they went along.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of those places that were empty, and there was a lot of floors empty because the whole manufacturing process had changed, and there wasn't all the diversified different products that they were running in there. And there was special departments just for the dental and special for medical, and the wood type was its own department, and that was all closed up when the wood type, you know, that building was empty. And so it was, they changed a lot of things around, but that was progress, so that really wasn't a sign of it shutting down. It's just that there was changing customers and things like that, though.
Well, and product was being, what, finished or completely built in other locations at that point?
They had a place in Mexico that they had put up in the early 90s, and then they also bought a place, epoxy resin top company in Arkansas. And so they had those two plants, but then they kept talking about, you know, the advantage. What's wrong with our product is we don't have flat line finishing. you can't flatline finish stuff we made. I mean, we flatlined doors and drawer fronts and all of that stuff. But the cabinet, you can't flatline. I mean, it's already assembled, and that's the way it was. But they insisted on that. So they bought a place in Texas, and that's where they moved all of the new machinery down there. There was a time when we had funding from the state and the union and all of the other places that we were going to make it a employee-owned, or we'd tried to make it an employee-owned company. And they didn't have it for sale then. But we don't want to sell. So then about 2 years later, when they're starting to move everything out, and then it was for sale.
Oh, yeah. When it was a little late.
Yeah, and I mean, now you've got all the stuff moved out.
Do you think it would have gone pretty well had you been able to do that? I mean, to make it an employee-owned plant?
I think so.
You could have called it Hamilton again, too.
Right, and you know, the quality would have still been there.
That's one of the things that I always hear about, is that the customers seem to know when it wasn't made in Two Rivers. You know, it had to be something that extended to all the departments, just that ability to do the work well.
Sure, and then, yeah, there was, you know, a lot of customers that didn't even put the job up for bid. They would just order from us because, you know, we had that kind of a quality standards that we had, and it worked out well. But after the Hitman took over, then we tried to, what do they call this? Value engineering.
It's a nice term, isn't it? You know?
That's cheap.
Yeah, value engineering. Wow. Well, it was a strange thing for me to see the ending of it, and I'm sure for you it had to seem even more unusual. Was it at a time when you thought about retiring, or do you think you would have liked to have been around a while longer had that been possible?
Oftentimes being old isn't a good thing, but at that time, but there is only one alternative to getting older, you know.
Yeah.
But you know, like a lot of the members and people that worked there were like 58 or 59. Yeah, we had, you could go to school for 2 years, you know, different careers that you could go into. But then who's going to hire you when you're 60 or 61, you know?
Right.
So it's, yeah, there was a lot of people that were definitely, and in my case, like I said, I was old enough to retire, so it wasn't a problem for me, but for all those other people it is.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. It was.
But I talked to a lot of them, and they do say there's life after Hamilton.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. We need to get more of them in here to talk about it, just because one of the things that we had started doing near the end was that book that you probably saw going around, where we just asked people to write their name and how many years, you know, because you couldn't go to Thermo and ask for employee records, which I understand, but you know, as you come in to the museum here, there's that crew from 1880 whatever, and it's nice, and they're an important crew, but you know, the crew from 2012, 2013 is just as important. It's just that the going out is not as formal as the coming in. You know, it's not as historic. Well, I appreciate the stories. It's been nice to hear about, and you know, we'll keep going. You'll have to come back when the others are doing their interviews, because you can correct them. You know, if they're
They correct me.
Yeah.
Well, sure, and then, you know, there's always some things that you remember, and when you're talking with other people, you know, there's a lot of joking that you can do with them, and talk about. Usually, you, in every experience, you normally you remember the good times. You don't remember the bad times. You know?
Yeah. Well, and I think his name was George Voicey. He was
Greg Voicey?
Greg Voicey, excuse me. Came into the museum one day with two granddaughters, and he remembered a few things about the place, but after he had been there a half hour and kind of warmed up talking, he remembered a lot of stuff about it. And
Yeah, he's a good guy. I worked with him a lot.
he seemed like a good guy. And it was nice because the stories kept coming and coming.
Yeah.
And
He's a good storyteller.
he was at that. He sure was. Well, I think that's all we need to do for today. That was pretty
good.
great. But I think if there are people in the audience who've got questions that they would like to ask, that would be just fine. So I think in the second row I see a...
So during sort of your golden time there, what would be a typical workday when you got there, and what would you do, and, you know, how did your work go?
The workload?
You know, just like, okay, I would get there, and then I would see what we were doing, and I would cut this, or, I mean, like, what did you do during the day?
Oh, I guess I can't hear her.
Really, I think she's just wondering, a typical day starts with what? You know, when you walked in there, first thing that you ought to do.
Well, when I first started, all of the card punch clocks were down in the entrances. So, well, they didn't like that idea because some people would get lost between the entrance and the department. So then they moved all of the punch clocks into the departments. So you had to be through the building and stop visiting with your friends and get there to punch in before you were late. And they had attendance policies that they always went nuts trying to keep in perspective, I guess. You know, you don't address the problem children, you change the rules for everybody, so then everybody has to have a reason to be there.
Did you have a crew that you had to kind of get going in the day, or did they have days work out in front of them usually?
We had, there was usually, they call them group leaders, gang leaders, group leaders, whatever, that were just second to the supervisor. You know, they got their orders from the supervisor, and then they handed out the workloads and stuff for that day. But a lot of the things that we did would take, you know, did mostly special products, and you know, some of those you'd work on for a month. You know, be all the same thing just to get it done. So it was, yeah, every day was, what I liked about my job was that there was something different, you know, not every day, but I mean, there was always a different challenge of trying to make something work. Or I did a lot of repairs and stuff too, to cabinets that they would come down and says, what do you think, Ken? Well, I don't know, let's look at it and then we can see if we can work it out. But and that always made it a good day.
Yeah.
And if it, you know, if a job becomes work, then it's not any fun. You got to find the better things in it.
Yeah, yeah, right. There was another question. I see a hand, but that... Georgie.
This is in regards to how when you weighed the wood, see if it was ready. So was that after the wood was already cut, and then would you weigh it in the beginning in one group, and then weigh it again, you know,
Yeah,
months later?
usually the weighing part was done with the wood type. So you'd cut a certain size block out of it when you just got it into the kiln. And then you took that block, put it in the kiln, and then weighed it again and recorded how much weight it lost. And there was some calculation that they used for the amount of weight that it lost versus what the humidity would be in the wood. So they had a sheet there that you could calculate it.
And did they always use that kiln, or towards the end did they not use the kiln and just strictly do air drying?
Now, on the wood type, you couldn't air dry because it needed to be dried, slowly, where when you air dry, you get a dry, humid, windy day or whatever, and then it gets all end grain cracking. Then that spoils the wood for type. Actually, we used to get all of our solid lumber, and our lumber yard was right up here where the Abundant Life Church is now.
Oh, really?
That was all lumber yard, and then they would bring it in there by railroad most of the time, and then they would haul it down to the main plant and put it into the kiln.
Okay. So those kilns could handle a pretty fair amount of wood, I suppose.
Yeah, they had a semi that you have some of the tracks. I think under the saw you have those tracks.
Yeah.
The wood would be piled with those tracks, and then everything operated on tracks. The truck had tracks on it where it rolled in. When it came in to drop the wood off, the tracks had to line up, and you locked them, and the piles of wood are probably, depending, most of the time it's like 8 feet long, probably about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide,
Okay.
and they're all drying strips in them.
Right, okay. Any other questions back there? We got them all? No? Dan?
Regarding the kiln, when I think of a kiln, I'm more familiar with the pottery kiln, which is very intense heat for not a real long time. What are we talking about in terms of the wood being in a kiln? How long and what kind of temperatures did it entail for getting the wood right?
Yeah, it was all steam heated, and then you had it was kind of crazy, but as you dried it, you had to inject steam into the kiln just to balance it so it didn't dry too fast, and it hardened the wood, I believe, and it tempered it, I guess. And then after they took it out of the kiln, then they would put it in their tempering building there that just cooled it down, and they had to maintain humidity in there also. But the length of time, it depended on the type of wood too. Like your oaks and ash and things that are more open grain, they dried quicker than your maples do. And so there was, they had about 2 guys that took care of the kiln all the time. And they pretty much knew they said they knew their stuff.
Yeah. Well,
No,
the
they
type
were
held up
good.
well, so I think they did.
No, they did.
All right. Well,
Well,
go ahead.
Good. I appreciate it. Nice to see all you people. I hope we enlightened you to some of these things, but perhaps we can see you again.
Well, and we'll have a second one in November or December. I think December 5th. Thanks, Steph. So we will we'll put out the word about that, and
Good.
and certainly you're welcome to come back and listen, or just give us some advice. That would be all right.
Sure, we can do that. Sounds like fun.
Yeah, well, good. I'll give credit to the Arts Board again because, that's the right way to do this. So I will. I'll say that we're supported in part by the Wisconsin Arts Board from a grant with funds from the state of Wisconsin and the National Endowments for the Arts. So thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate having you here today and getting this started well. And thank you.
No, okay.
Thanks.